It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. And that's what made it so brutal. On a night dedicated to honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man whose dream was rooted in unity, dignity, and moral courage, two of Hollywood's most respected black actors took the stage and undid someone. Quietly, surgically, publicly. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And they did it with just a whisper, a joke, a look. You probably saw the headlines. Maybe even the clip. Maybe you scrolled past it, thinking it was just another celebrity roasting moment. But pause for a second, because something different happened here. Something uncomfortable. Something precise. Anika Noni rose. Broadway royalty. The voice of Disney's first black princess. A woman who has spent decades carefully cultivating a reputation of poise, purpose, and authenticity. Aldis Hodge. Respected actor. Thinker. Physical presence with a quiet power. More known for saying less and letting the weight of his words carry their own momentum. These two aren't chaos chasers. They don't stir mess for attention. They don't shade people for applause. So when both of them, hosting the 2026 Beloved Community Awards in Atlanta, turned the room on its head with just 5 words, people paid attention. 5 words that made Meghan Markle's smile falter mid-laugh. 5 words that weren't even shouted. And one of those words? Yacht. Let that sit. You see, this moment didn't come out of nowhere. But it hit like it did. The tension was silent, but razor sharp. And it landed like a blade sliding under the surface. No blood at first, just shock. Then impact. The phrase, yacht princess, wasn't screamed. It wasn't a punchline thrown into a comedy set. It was dropped into the middle of a formal, reverent ceremony meant to honor peace. And the people who heard it didn't laugh. They froze. And Meghan? She blinked, swallowed, and then she stopped clapping. Now, we're not here to sensationalize a single moment. But you have to ask, why this stage? Why now? And why Meghan? The truth is, there's been a growing discomfort, one not often voiced in public, about the way Meghan Markle has positioned herself within the black community. The dual identities she leans into, the narratives she highlights, and the ones she avoids, the past she denies, and the whispers that never go away. And Anika and Aldis? Maybe they weren't joking. Maybe they were answering those whispers. Out loud. What if this wasn't shade at all? What if it was a signal? A quiet verdict from voices that mattered? We're going to walk through what happened that night, moment by moment, line by line, silence by silence. And when we do, you'll start to realize something. This wasn't an accident. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started like any other award ceremony. Red carpet, flashbulbs, anchored smiles, velvet gowns, bow ties. Atlanta's air that night was thick with reverence and expectation. The Beloved Community Awards are not light affairs. They don't play to headlines or hype. They play to legacy, to continuity, to meaning. And so when Aldis Hodge and Anika Noni Rose were announced as co-hosts, the room buzzed, but in a different key. Not the gossipy flutter of who's wearing what, or what will the opening joke be. No, this was more measured. Anchored. They were chosen for a reason. Aldis, known for his depth both on and off screen, has long been vocal about justice, community, and the weight of black identity in Hollywood. He's not the kind to play into spectacle. He's the kind who measures every word. Anika, the quiet storm. Broadway trained. Sharp. Deliberate. The type of artist who has turned down more roles than she's accepted, not out of ego, but out of principle. So when they walked on stage together, there was a stillness in the room. A sense of, okay, we're in good hands. Their opening monologue was graceful, tender, a soft honoring of Dr. King's legacy. They spoke about dreams, resistance, the tension of joy in the face of injustice. There was laughter, but it wasn't shallow. It was full-bodied, purposeful. Then something shifted. It wasn't abrupt. No music cue. No change in lighting. Just a pause. Anika glanced sideways at Aldis. He nodded. Barely. And she exhaled. That's when the language began to change. Less about history. More about now. Aldis leaned into the mic. His voice dropped half a register. He said, legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you embody when no one's watching. And the room got quiet. Then Anika picked it up. And in a time when image moves faster than integrity, we have to ask ourselves, who are we really applauding? And why? It didn't sound like shade. Not yet. But it was coded. Sharp. You could see people shifting in their seats. Some faces lit up in recognition. Others froze. Because it was subtle, but unmistakable. And Meghan Markle? She was sitting front row, smiling, but not as widely now. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't clapping. The camera cut to her once, then didn't again. Now here's the thing. Meghan hadn't been announced as an honoree. She wasn't scheduled to speak. She wasn't seated with the other celebrities. She was just there. And no one seemed quite sure why. Was she invited? Almost certainly. But was she meant to be the focus of that room? That's less clear. Because you could feel it, couldn't you? That unspoken electricity. That simmering question. What's she doing here? And then came the moment that flipped the room. It was Anika again, standing center stage, poised, holding a cue card, but not reading it. She smiled, just a little, and said, "You know, it's funny how some folks start off as suits, then find themselves in palaces, and somehow end up as yacht royalty." There it was. That word. Yacht. And the air went still. She didn't name names. But she didn't have to. And Aldis, who had been off to the side, just shook his head and muttered, "That one's for the real ones." Then silence. No applause. Just held breath. Because everyone knew. Even if they didn't want to. And now you have to ask yourself, why would two of the most respected black actors in the industry take that moment? This moment, to say that? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip. It was a message. But what kind of message? And who else was it meant for? That part, that comes next. And it's not what you're expecting. Why that word? Of all the metaphors they could have used, of all the subtle digs they could have chosen, why yacht? It wasn't loud. It wasn't repeated. But it echoed. And in the right circles, the very specific, very online, very plugged-in corners of the internet, yacht means something. It's not about boats. Not really. It's about whispered histories. About who had access before they had power. About how someone moves through elite spaces when they're not yet supposed to be there. So when Anika Noni Rose dropped that line, yacht royalty, and Aldis Hodge added, "That one's for the real ones," it wasn't just an inside joke. It was a signal, a flare, a cultural Rorschach test. And the room? It split. Some laughed, hesitantly. Some looked around to gauge reactions before reacting themselves. And some froze. Because they knew. Meghan? She didn't laugh. Her smile, mid-formation, collapsed like scaffolding. She looked down, then up, then over, to someone off stage. Maybe a handler. Maybe no one at all. The camera didn't return to her. But those in the room say her entire posture changed. She leaned back. She crossed her arms. And for the rest of the night, she never stood again. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Because on the surface, that phrase could be explained away. A playful jab at someone's rise to fame. A quirky metaphor for success. A reference to luxury culture. Right? Except, no one else in that room fit that profile. No one else in the audience had gone from Hollywood minor roles to global icon via marriage into monarchy. And no one else had been dogged for years by persistent, unverified, but never quite dying rumors that they once occupied certain high-end spaces, not as guests, but as companions. Let's pause there, because this is where the story gets slippery, and frankly, dangerous. The so-called yacht girl rumor about Meghan Markle isn't new. It predates her engagement to Prince Harry. It floated around gossip blogs in Europe, social media deep dives, anonymous Reddit threads. Usually dismissed. Sometimes weaponized. No concrete evidence. But always there. Lingering. Like smoke that won't clear. She's never addressed it publicly. And most credible outlets won't touch it. Until now, no one from within the black artistic community had referenced it. Not directly. Not this boldly. Not on a microphone. Which makes you ask, why now? Why her? And why them? Why would Anika Noni Rose, known for elegance and restraint, wade into a rumor this messy? And Aldis Hodge, who has spoken passionately about the dignity of black women, co-sign it in front of a room full of cameras? Unless they weren't trying to humiliate. They were trying to clarify. Maybe this wasn't about dragging Meghan down. Maybe it was about drawing a line in the sand. There's a difference between being for the community and using it when it's convenient. And to some people in that room, Meghan's presence didn't feel like pride. It felt like branding. And that is what made the joke sting so deeply. Because if you know, you know. Yacht royalty. Not just rich, not just glamorous, performative, polished, but, in the eyes of some, not real. Still, this wasn't a takedown in the traditional sense. No shouting, no confrontation, no direct call-out, just a phrase, a knowing glance, and a room that didn't quite know how to respond. Was it courage? Pettiness? Justice? Bitterness? Maybe all of it. Or maybe something even more complicated. Because the people in that room, the artists, the thinkers, the leaders, they understand legacy. They understand coded language. And when the hosts speak in code, and half the audience responds without needing it decoded, that says something. It says there's a conversation that's been waiting to happen. And this was the start. But the real impact wasn't in the moment. It came afterward. In the quiet. In the exits. In who stayed for the after-event photos. And who didn't. What happened in the next 30 minutes would leave Meghan Markle more isolated than ever. And this time, it wasn't the British press. It was her own reflection staring back at her from across the room. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels loaded, pregnant with judgment, confusion, restraint. And in that Atlanta ballroom, right after the yacht princess line dropped, that's exactly what wrapped around the room. No boos, no gasps, just stillness, which, in this context, was louder than any outburst could have been. You have to understand, the audience that night wasn't random. It wasn't full of influencers looking for selfies or tabloids hoping for scandals. This was a carefully curated gathering of artists, thinkers, activists, and legacy families. People who don't flinch easily. People who know the weight of a stage. So when they didn't react, when the collective temperature dropped, that said more than applause ever could. Some leaned in, whispering to their neighbors. Some shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should laugh. Others, those closest to the front, went completely still. And Meghan? She froze, then recalibrated. Not visibly. She's trained far too well for that. But the micro-expressions gave her away. A brief widening of the eyes. A sharp inhale. The slow, deliberate folding of her arms. She knew. It wasn't just a line anymore. It had landed. And she was at the center of it. What's wild is, nobody said her name. Not once. But everyone understood who the message was for. It hung in the air like static. And every second it remained unacknowledged, it grew louder. Now let's talk about who did react, just not with words. Issa Rae, seated mid-row, tilted her head and blinked. Not in shock, more like realization. As if something made sense now that hadn't before. Viola Davis, positioned toward the left, didn't clap. She stared at the stage, then glanced toward Meghan's table, briefly, before looking down. Even Jonathan Majors, who usually exudes a calculated calm, looked up with the kind of expression you make when someone says something bold in a room full of elders. There was no recovery moment. No effort to pivot. Anika and Aldis didn't backtrack, didn't soften the mood. They moved on, coolly, seamlessly, into the next segment of the night. But the energy? It was gone. Something had cracked. By the time the final award was announced, Meghan was no longer at her table. Some say she left right after the joke. Others say she stayed for one more segment and exited quietly during a video tribute. But no one really saw her go. She just wasn't there anymore. And that absence spoke volumes. When the group photo was taken on stage, those invited guests, community leaders, and honorees, her seat was empty, and nobody filled it. Later, her publicist would issue a brief statement to Variety. Meghan deeply respects the mission of the beloved Community Awards and was honored to attend in support of Black excellence and legacy. Short, clean, no mention of the hosts, no mention of the moment, just a subtle attempt to redirect attention to the night's original purpose. But by then, the clips were already viral. Not just the yacht princess line, but the audience's reaction, or lack thereof. Twitter, well, X now was split. Half called it savage brilliance. Others called it beneath the dignity of the night. But one thing was clear across the board. This wasn't a joke. It was a statement. And for Meghan, it wasn't just a hit to the image. It was something worse. Disapproval. Not from strangers. Not from tabloid media. But from her own community. Or at least, from people who carry cultural weight within it. People who've been watching. Waiting. And maybe, finally, decided to speak. Not with protest, not with tweets, but with silence. And in the world Meghan now inhabits, where branding is everything and silence equals consent, this kind of silence, it burns. Still, the question lingers. Was this a personal attack or a cultural correction? And perhaps more importantly, was this the beginning of something? Because as the cameras stopped rolling and guests exited into the Atlanta night, more than one person was heard saying quietly, "She won't come back from that." It was just a moment. A sentence, really. Maybe less.